Tanya Williams had spent years saving every dollar she could to finally move her family to a safe neighborhood with decent schools and friendly neighbors. As a single mother of two, she'd faced her share of struggles but knew that this home was a chance for her children, Jaden, age 10, and Maya, age 15, to grow up in a place where they could thrive. Their new apartment, though modest, was in an area renowned for its safety, and Tanya hoped it would offer a fresh start. But from the moment Tanya signed the lease, she noticed subtle signs that made her feel unwelcome. The landlord, Mr. Allen, was a stiff, wiry man with a forced smile that never quite reached his eyes. During the move-in inspection, he barely looked her in the eye and made veiled comments about expectations for maintaining his property. Tanya brushed it off, assuming he was just particular about his tenants. But as the days went on, it became clear that he treated her and her children differently from other tenants. Every minor thing became an excuse for Mr. Allen to check in on them. A small spot on the carpet drew his disdain, and he'd sigh audibly when he saw Jaden playing outside, as if the boy's mere presence was an inconvenience. The neighbors, all white, exchanged uncomfortable glances but remained silent. One evening, Tanya found herself face to face with Mr. Allen as he inspected the garden outside their unit. "Mrs. Williams," he began in his clipped tone, "I'm sure you understand that this neighborhood has standards. I expect you and your family to abide by them." Tanya felt her pulse quicken, the underlying message clear, but she smiled politely and nodded. "Of course, Mr. Allen." Her children, however, were noticing. Maya would often ask, "Mom, why does Mr. Allen act like we're doing something wrong?" Each time, Tanya would respond with the same placating tone, telling her children to ignore him and keep their heads high. Yet the weight of Mr. Allen's prejudice started to wear on them all. The tipping point came when Tanya received a notice about noise complaints. According to Mr. Allen, several neighbors had reported loud music coming from her unit. The reality, however, was far from his claim. Tanya knew she rarely played music, and her children's laughter was hardly the ruckus he described. Fuming, she decided it was time to confront him. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she approached his office door. Her knock was answered by Mr. Allen's curt voice. "Come in." She walked in, straightening her posture. "Mr. Allen, I received a notice about noise complaints, but we hardly make any noise. I'd like to know where these complaints are coming from." Mr. Allen didn't even look up from his papers. "Mrs. Williams, I have a reputation to uphold. If neighbors say there's noise, I trust their word." Tanya clenched her fists, biting her lip to keep from lashing out. "We have rights, Mr. Allen. You can't keep making baseless accusations." The landlord finally looked up, his face devoid of any sympathy. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere, more fitting." His words stung, and Tanya knew that this wasn't about noise. This was about her family, their skin color, and their right to exist in a place that saw them as outsiders. Days later, Tanya returned home to find a familiar face waiting outside her building. Mrs. Johnson, a retired school teacher who lived 2 floors above, had always smiled kindly at Tanya's children, sometimes even offering them cookies when they passed her door. "Mrs. Williams," she greeted Tanya warmly, though her face was etched with worry, "I heard what Mr. Allen has been doing. It's wrong, and I want you to know I'm here if you need help." Touched by the support, Tanya felt a glimmer of hope. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. I'm doing my best to keep calm, but it's been hard." Mrs. Johnson leaned in, her voice low but fierce. "The way he treats you is unacceptable. You're not the first family he's harassed. I know some people who might be able to help." That evening, Mrs. Johnson introduced Tanya to a community advocacy group that specialized in tenant rights. Over the next few weeks, Tanya learned more about her legal options. Together, they documented every interaction, every notice, every subtle insult. The group assured Tanya that they'd seen landlords like Mr. Allen before, and they wouldn't stand for it. Encouraged, Tanya decided she wouldn't let Mr. Allen's racism drive her and her children out of their home. She filed a formal complaint with the local housing authority, providing the documentation she'd gathered with Mrs. Johnson's help. Mr. Allen was not pleased. He responded with threats of eviction, citing vague breaches of the lease. The following morning, a cold winter day, Tanya received an eviction notice. Her heart sank. She knew it was retaliation, but it still hit her hard. Her children were distraught. with Jaden asking, "Mom, are we leaving? What did we do wrong?" For the first time, Tanya's strength wavered, but with the community's support, she held her ground. Mr. Allen filed for an official eviction, which landed them a court date. By then, Tanya's story had spread throughout the neighborhood. Support poured in from local activists, and even a few neighbors who'd witnessed Mr. Allen's behavior stepped forward as witnesses. The courtroom was tense as Mr. Allen presented his case, depicting Tanya's family as troublesome and disruptive. But Tanya's lawyer, a fierce advocate from the tenant rights organization, countered each claim with hard evidence of Mr. Allen's discrimination. The turning point came when Mrs. Johnson, with her gentle but unwavering resolve, recounted how she'd seen Mr. Allen harass other black families in the past. When it was Tanya's turn to speak, she poured her heart out, describing the strain Mr. Allen's prejudice had placed on her family and her children. She could feel the weight of the judge's gaze on her, the air in the room thick with tension. As the judge listened to Tanya's testimony, his expression softened, revealing a deep-seated disapproval for Mr. Allen's actions. The judge knew this case wasn't merely about an eviction. It was about a family fighting to exist peacefully in a place they had every right to call home. When it was time for Mr. Allen's lawyer to respond, he stammered, knowing they were losing ground. Despite his best efforts to cast Tanya and her children as problematic tenants, the carefully documented evidence spoke volumes. Photos of the notices, statements from witnesses, and, most compelling of all, Mrs. Johnson's quiet but powerful testimony painted a vivid picture of Mr. Allen's pattern of discrimination. The judge adjusted his glasses and turned to Mr. Allen, his gaze unyielding. "Mr. Allen," he began, "it's clear that your grievances go beyond mere noise complaints or maintenance issues." A hush fell over the courtroom. Mr. Allen's face tightened as he straightened his posture, but he didn't respond. The judge continued, "I want you to know that, as an officer of the court, I take accusations of racial discrimination very seriously. And from what I've seen here today, your behavior toward the Williams family has been egregious, to say the least." Mr. Allen's attorney squirmed, attempting to redirect the focus. "Your Honor, this is merely a matter of property standards. My client runs a respectable establishment, and we have every right to ensure—" "Enough," the judge interrupted, his tone final. "Mrs. Williams and her children have shown themselves to be respectful, law-abiding tenants. I see no evidence that their presence here has caused any harm beyond your discomfort, Mr. Allen." A murmur rippled through the audience. Tanya clutched her hands together tightly, relief flooding over her. But the judge wasn't finished. With a slight pause, the judge shuffled through some papers and lifted his eyes to the court again. "It's come to my attention," he began, "that this isn't the first time you've faced accusations of discriminatory practices, Mr. Allen." Gasps echoed across the room as the audience leaned in, eager to hear what the judge had discovered. Mr. Allen's face turned ashen, his confidence faltering. "I have records here indicating previous complaints filed by other tenants of color who described similar patterns of harassment and wrongful eviction. These complaints, unfortunately, were previously settled out of court." Tanya's lawyer seized the moment, her voice ringing with clarity. "Your Honor, this clearly shows a pattern of racially biased behavior. Mr. Allen has systematically targeted families like the Williams family, attempting to drive them out under false pretenses." "Mrs. Williams was merely the latest victim," the judge nodded. "Indeed, and I believe it's time we put an end to this." Mr. Allen's attorney scrambled, whispering furiously to his client. But it was no use. The damage had been done. After a brief recess, the judge returned with a ruling. "In light of the overwhelming evidence, I am denying Mr. Allen's request for eviction. Furthermore, I am ordering an investigation into Mr. Allen's rental practices and financial penalties for the emotional distress he's caused Mrs. Williams and her family." The courtroom erupted in applause, and Tanya's children beamed with pride as they watched their mother stand tall, victorious against a man who had tried to rob them of their dignity. Mr. Allen slumped in his seat, his carefully crafted facade shattered. But the impact didn't end there. The news of the case spread quickly, and soon Mr. Allen's reputation within the neighborhood was in ruins. People who had once accepted his authority now questioned his motives, and former tenants came forward to share their own stories of mistreatment. Local media picked up the story, and interviews with Tanya and her children sparked a larger conversation about discrimination in housing. People rallied in support, and the neighborhood began to transform into a more inclusive, accepting community. Mrs. Johnson, who had first encouraged Tanya to stand up, was especially thrilled. "You've shown everyone what strength looks like, Tanya. We're all better for it," she said, giving Tanya a warm embrace. With her name cleared and her family's place secure, Tanya found a newfound sense of belonging. She became an advocate for others facing similar situations, helping tenants understand their rights and fight back against discrimination. In time, Mr. Allen was forced to sell his properties. A new fair-minded landlord took over, one who prioritized diversity and respect. The Williams family flourished, Jaden and Maya excelling in school and making friends without fear or prejudice, shadowing their every move. One evening, as they sat down for dinner in their cozy apartment, Jaden looked at his mom with admiration. "Mom, you didn't give up on us." Tanya smiled, her heart full. "That's right, baby. Sometimes you have to fight for what's right. And it was worth it, wasn't it?" In that moment, Tanya knew they had found something more precious than any property. They had found hope, resilience, and a community that would stand by them in their journey forward. As the evening deepened, Tanya looked out their window, reflecting on the journey they'd endured and the community that had grown around them. Where once there was tension and isolation, now neighbors shared greetings, exchanged smiles, and welcomed her children with open arms. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, she found Mrs. Johnson standing there with a few other neighbors, each holding dishes of food, a couple with flowers, and one even holding a small, framed, welcome sign painted with bright colors. "We wanted to welcome you properly this time," Mrs. Johnson said, her eyes warm and bright. "After everything, we all wanted you to know that this community is as much yours as anyone else's." Tanya's eyes welled with tears. She invited them in, overwhelmed with gratitude as everyone set up food, pulling chairs around the small dining table to join her family. As they shared stories and laughter, Tanya realized this was the sense of belonging she'd fought so hard for, not just for her, but for her children, for everyone who needed to feel seen, valued, and safe. As the night went on, her children played freely with the neighbors' kids, the air alive with laughter and warmth. For the first time in a long time, Tanya felt an unshakable peace, knowing that they had carved a place in this world where they could be themselves without fear. As they gathered to say their goodbyes, Mrs. Johnson hugged Tanya, whispering, "You did it, my dear. You changed all of us." With tears in her eyes, Tanya hugged her back. She knew that while their journey had been hard, it had been worth every struggle, every tear, every fight. In the faces of her children, in the kindness of her neighbors, Tanya saw the future, a future where they didn't have to fight just to belong, because they already did. And as they closed the door that night, Tanya realized something she had once thought impossible. This place was finally, truly, their home.